What if I told you that sometimes, the only way to catch a killer is to confess to a murder you didn't commit? That a young man would willingly walk into a police station, look investigators in the eye, and claim responsibility for his stepsister's brutal death, knowing full well he was innocent. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Nicole Vandenhurk, a 15-year-old girl who vanished from the streets of Eindhoven, Netherlands, in 1995. Her case would remain unsolved for 15 years until a desperate act of deception finally exposed the truth. Before we dive into this unbelievable case, if you're fascinated by true crime stories that challenge everything you think you know about justice, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. And make sure to like this video to help us continue bringing you the most compelling true crime cases from around the world. On a summer day in 1980, July 4th to be exact, a baby girl was born in Eindhoven, a small town nestled in the western region of Germany. Her name was Nicole, and from the moment she entered the world, her life would be marked by change, loss, and ultimately, tragedy. Nicole's early years were shaped by her mother Angelica's decisions. Shortly after Nicole's birth, Angelica met a man named Ad Vandenhurk. The connection between them was strong enough that they decided to marry, and with that union came a significant life change for the small family. Ad, Angelica, and young Nicole left Germany behind and relocated to the Netherlands, a country known for its windmills, tulips, and intricate canal systems. It was in this new homeland that Nicole would grow up, and it was here that she took on her stepfather's surname, becoming Nicole Vandenhurk. For a child, such transitions can be difficult, but Nicole adapted. She was building a life in a new country, learning a new culture, and becoming part of a blended family. But as anyone who has experienced family dynamics knows, not all marriages are built to last. The relationship between Angelica and Ad began to show signs of straying. Whatever love had initially brought them together started to fade, replaced by tension and discord. The fractures in their marriage widened over time, and by 1989, when Nicole was just 9 years old, her mother and stepfather made the decision to divorce. Divorce is never easy, especially for children caught in the middle. Custody arrangements had to be made, and in this case, the courts awarded custody of Nicole to her stepfather, Ad Vandenhurk. This meant that Nicole would continue to live with the man who had given her his last name, even though he wasn't her biological father. It's a testament to their relationship that Ed wanted to raise Nicole as his own, and by all accounts, they maintained a close bond. Fast forward to 1995. Nicole was now 15 years old, navigating the tumultuous teenage years that so many young people find challenging. She was living with her grandmother in the city of Eindhoven, a vibrant urban center in the southern Netherlands. Eindhoven was known for being a hub of technology and innovation, home to companies like Philips, but it was also a city where families lived, worked, and raised their children. For Nicole, it was home. Despite living with her grandmother, Nicole maintained regular contact with her stepfather Ad and his wife Yolanda, who also lived in Eindhoven. The family dynamics seemed stable on the surface, but 1995 had already been a year marked by profound tragedy for Nicole. Earlier that year, her mother Angelica had died by suicide. For a 15-year-old girl, losing a parent in such a traumatic way is devastating beyond measure. The grief, the unanswered questions, the pain of such a loss, these are burdens no teenager should have to carry. But Nicole, by all accounts, was resilient. She pushed forward with her life despite the overwhelming sadness she must have felt. She attended school regularly, maintained friendships, and even took on a part-time job to earn some money. That autumn, she had secured a seasonal position at a bakery located in a shopping center not far from where she lived. It was the kind of first job many teenagers take on, working weekends, learning responsibility, earning a bit of independence. Nicole was juggling her schoolwork, her social life, and her job at the bakery, trying to build a normal teenage existence despite the trauma she'd endured. Friday, October 6, 1995, started like any other day. Nicole had a shift at the bakery that morning, and she needed to get there. She said goodbye to her grandmother, grabbed her bicycle, the preferred mode of transportation for many people in the Netherlands, and set off pedaling toward the shopping center. The distance wasn't far. It should have been a routine trip, one she'd made many times before. But Nicole Vandenhurk never made it to work that morning. She vanished somewhere between her grandmother's house and the shopping center, disappearing into thin air on a route she knew well. When she failed to show up for her shift, concern began to build. Nicole was a responsible young woman. She wasn't the type to simply skip work without calling. Something was wrong. Local police were notified, and they immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. A 15-year-old girl missing on her way to work was not something to be taken lightly. The Eindhoven Police Department quickly mobilized resources, forming a specialized task force dedicated entirely to finding Nicole. This wasn't just one or two officers making inquiries. They assembled a team of 15 dedicated officers whose sole focus would be locating the missing teenager and figuring out what had happened to her. The search began in earnest. Officers fanned out across the area between Nicole's grandmother's home and the shopping center, looking for any sign of the girl or her bicycle. They interviewed potential witnesses, checked nearby businesses, and tried to retrace the route Nicole would have taken. For hours, they searched without finding anything concrete. Then, at 6 o'clock that evening, they discovered their first major clue. Nicole's bicycle was found in the Damo River near a water treatment plant. The discovery was both encouraging and deeply troubling. On one hand, they'd found physical evidence connected to Nicole, which gave them a starting point. On the other hand, finding her bicycle submerged in the river suggested that something bad had happened. The bicycle hadn't ended up in the water by accident. Someone had put it there, and the most likely reason was to hide evidence of a crime. The police immediately brought in a specialized team of divers from the fire department. These weren't just regular firefighters. They were trained in underwater search and recovery operations. Their mission was to search the murky waters of the Damo River for any further evidence of what had happened to Nicole, and more grimly, to search for Nicole herself. The divers entered the cold water and began their systematic search, covering the area around where the bicycle had been found and expanding outward from there. Despite their expertise and thoroughness, the divers came up empty-handed. They found no other evidence in the water, no sign of Nicole. This was both a relief and a source of frustration for investigators. If Nicole wasn't in the river, where was she? And why had her bicycle been thrown into the water? Over the next several days, the investigation continued at full intensity, but progress was slow. The police task force began conducting formal interviews with everyone who knew Nicole. They spoke with her family members, trying to understand her state of mind in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. They talked to her friends from school, asking about her relationships, her activities, whether she'd mentioned any problems or conflicts. They interviewed her coworkers at the bakery, looking for any unusual interactions or concerning incidents. The investigators were looking for motive, for enemies, for any red flags in Nicole's life that might explain why someone would want to harm her. They were also looking for any indication that Nicole might have run away, though given that she'd left for work that morning and never made it there, this seemed unlikely. But police have to consider every possibility, and they did so in this case. What they found was frustrating in its ordinariness. Nicole appeared to be a typical 15-year-old girl. She had friends. She went to school. She worked at a bakery. There were no obvious enemies, no major conflicts, no threatening situations that anyone knew about. Her family relationships seemed stable. There was no evidence of abuse or mistreatment. The recent loss of her mother was tragic, but Nicole had been coping with her grief and moving forward with her life. The police publicly acknowledged that while they had no concrete evidence a crime had been committed, they also hadn't ruled out the possibility that Nicole had fallen victim to foul play. It was a careful statement, designed not to cause panic but also not to give false hope. The truth was, they simply didn't know what had happened to Nicole Vandenhurk. 3 days after Nicole's disappearance, on October 9th, the investigation took an unexpected turn. That day, the city's riot police became involved in the search, and the reason for their involvement was intriguing. 5 minors had been apprehended and were being held at the Eindhoven police station on suspicion of public violence. These weren't just random troublemakers. These teenagers had been terrorizing people in a specific area of the city, harassing and attacking cyclists and pedestrians along a route called the Vassenveld. What made this particularly relevant to Nicole's case was geography and connection. The Vassenveld was a cycle route that passed through part of Eindhoven, and it was in the same general area where Nicole was last seen. More significantly, some of the teenagers who had been arrested attended the same school as Nicole. They knew her, at least in passing. The timing was also suspicious. Had these violent teenagers encountered Nicole on the morning of October 6th? Had something gone wrong? Had a confrontation escalated into something terrible? The police certainly thought it was worth investigating thoroughly. They weren't going to take any chances. The riot police assembled a massive search team, a platoon of 45 officers, and deployed them to Eckhart Woods, a densely forested area on the outskirts of the city. This woodland area was located behind the water treatment plant, close to where Nicole's bicycle had been pulled from the Dommel River. If the teenagers had done something to Nicole, the woods would be a logical place to hide evidence, or, tragically, to hide a body. The search of Eckhart Woods was extensive and methodical. 45 officers on foot, moving through the trees, looking under bushes, checking ditches, examining every area where something or someone might be concealed. But the search efforts didn't stop there. A plane was brought in to assist with the investigation, flying overhead to examine bodies of water from an aerial perspective. Sometimes, what can't be seen from the ground becomes visible from the air, and police were hoping this aerial surveillance might reveal something the ground teams had missed. Meanwhile, back at Nicole's school, regular police officers were conducting interviews with her classmates. They were asking questions, trying to get a sense of the social dynamics, looking for anyone who might have information about what happened to Nicole or about the teenagers who'd been arrested for violence. It was a multi-pronged approach, and the police were throwing every available resource at the case. Over the following several days, the investigation generated new activity. 15 additional tips came in from members of the public, people who thought they might have seen something or knew something relevant. Each tip, no matter how insignificant it might seem, was investigated by the task force. They couldn't afford to dismiss anything that might lead them to Nicole. The police also began searching the overflow sewers near the Dommel River. These underground passages were dark, unpleasant places to search, but they had to be checked. Interestingly, according to some reports, the decision to search these areas came from an unusual source. Nicole's father, Vandenhurk, and his wife Yolanda had apparently consulted with a psychic in their desperate search for answers. The psychic had suggested certain locations, and the grieving family had passed this information along to police. While law enforcement generally doesn't put much stock in supernatural guidance, they also weren't going to ignore any potential lead when a girl's life might be at stake. The involvement of psychics didn't end there. Several other mediums reached out to investigators, offering their intuitive insights about what had happened to Nicole and where she might be found. The police listened politely and followed up on anything that seemed concrete enough to check, but ultimately, none of these psychic leads produced useful results. This is typically the case in criminal investigations. While families in distress often turn to psychics for hope and guidance, the reality is that these supernatural claims rarely lead to actual breakthroughs in cases. 11 days after Nicole's disappearance, on October 17th, the police made a significant decision regarding one aspect of their search. They conducted a final, thorough search of the Dommel River, deploying resources one more time to check the waterway where Nicole's bicycle had been found. After this comprehensive search, they publicly concluded that it was unlikely Nicole was in the water. The divers had found nothing. The aerial surveillance had revealed nothing. If Nicole had gone into the river, they would have found her by now. This meant she was somewhere else, but where? The very next day, October 18th, something interesting happened. An anonymous letter arrived at the police station. Anonymous tips are common in criminal investigations, and they range from genuinely helpful information to complete nonsense. This particular letter, however, contained specific details that got the investigators' attention. The writer claimed to have witnessed something suspicious on the morning of Nicole's disappearance. According to the letter, A suspicious car had been seen near the Vossenveld on October 6, right around the time Nicole would have been cycling to work. The anonymous tipster even provided a license plate number. This seemed promising. A suspicious vehicle, a specific location, a concrete detail like a license plate number that could be traced. The police would have immediately run that license plate through their system, trying to identify the vehicle's owner. They would have located and interviewed that person, asking where they were on the morning of October 6th and whether they had any connection to Nicole Vandenhurk. But whatever came of this investigation, it apparently didn't pan out. The lead seems to have been dismissed or ruled out, though the exact details of why aren't entirely clear from available records. On October 19th, 13 days after Nicole disappeared, another piece of physical evidence was recovered. Nicole's backpack was found on the side of a road close to the Eindhoven Canal. This was significant for several reasons. First, it was another concrete piece of evidence that could potentially yield forensic clues, fingerprints, DNA, anything that might identify who had taken Nicole. Second, the location was important. The backpack was found near the canal, which was a different waterway from the Dommel River where her bicycle had been discovered. This suggested movement, a geographical spread to the crime that might help investigators understand what had happened. Around this same time, investigators made a trip to Germany to interview members of Nicole's mother's family. Nicole's mother, Angelica, had been German, and she still had relatives living there. The police wanted to know if Nicole had maintained contact with these relatives, if there was any possibility she might have gone to Germany, if anyone there might have information about her disappearance. It was thorough police work, leaving no stone unturned. The day after the backpack was found, on October 20th, a new search operation was launched. This one focused on the south side of the Eindhoven Canal, near where the backpack had been recovered. The police brought in specialized scent dogs for this search, animals trained specifically in detecting human remains in water. These dogs have an incredible ability to smell decomposition even when a body is submerged, and they can alert their handlers to areas that should be searched more carefully. Officers also searched on foot along the canal banks, looking for any other evidence that might have been discarded or hidden. Despite these efforts and despite the recent discoveries of Nicole's backpack and bicycle, the investigation was moving frustratingly slowly. New leads were few and far between. The police publicly acknowledged that after the backpack was found, the number of new tips coming in had decreased significantly. This is a common pattern in missing persons cases. There's initial public attention and concern, people come forward with information, but as days turn into weeks without resolution, public attention wanes and the tips dry up. Then, on October 24th, something happened that reignited public interest in Nicole's case. A national television program aired a segment about her disappearance. The program laid out the facts of the case, showed photographs of Nicole, and made a direct appeal to the public for information. If anyone had seen anything, if anyone knew anything, they were urged to come forward and contact the police. Television appeals like this can be incredibly effective in generating new leads, and this one certainly was. The response was overwhelming. Following the broadcast, approximately 80 new tips poured into the police hotline. People who had seen the program and remembered something, or thought they might have seen Nicole, or had suspicions about someone in their community, all reached out to investigators. The police were pleased with this influx of information and publicly stated that they believed roughly half of these tips, about 40 of them, were worth serious investigation. This represented a significant amount of new work for the task force, but it also represented hope that somewhere in those 40 leads might be the information that would crack the case. However, in the first week of November, the investigation took a controversial and, to some, baffling turn. With no physical evidence of foul play, no viable suspects, and weeks having passed without finding Nicole, investigators began to develop a new theory about what had happened. They started to publicly suggest that perhaps Nicole hadn't been the victim of a violent crime at all. Perhaps, they theorized, she had run away from home. This theory emerged from the lack of evidence. There was no crime scene. There was no body. There was no witness to an abduction or assault. Nicole's bicycle and backpack had been found, but these could have been discarded by Nicole herself if she wanted to disappear. The police knew that Nicole had experienced significant trauma earlier that year with her mother's suicide. Could the grief and emotional pain have become too much? Could she have decided to run away and start over somewhere else? To explore this theory more thoroughly, authorities began re-interviewing people who were close to Nicole. They were asking different questions now, questions about her emotional state, whether she talked about wanting to leave, whether there were problems at home or school that might have motivated her to run. And they received information that seemed to support this new theory. In late October, a tip had come in from a man who claimed to have seen a girl matching Nicole's description. The sighting had occurred on October 6, the very day Nicole disappeared, at a petrol station in Venlo. Now, Venlo is a city in the Netherlands, but it's located right on the border with Germany. If someone wanted to leave the Netherlands and go to Germany, Venlo would be a logical place to pass through. If this sighting was accurate, it meant Nicole had made it much farther from Eindhoven than anyone had initially thought, and she was heading toward Germany. The police publicly stated that they believed Nicole might be in Germany. This represented a major shift in the investigation, from treating her as the victim of a crime to treating her as a runaway. Not everyone agreed with this new direction. Nicole's father, Ad Vandenhurk, disagreed strongly with the police theory. He knew his daughter, and he didn't believe she would run away. He didn't believe she was alive and hiding somewhere in Germany. He thought something terrible had happened to her, and he wanted police to continue investigating her disappearance as a potential crime. Interestingly, Nicole's German grandmother had a different perspective. She told reporters that she believed the police were on the right track. She thought Nicole might indeed be somewhere of her own free will, somewhere she felt happy and safe. It's unclear whether this was genuine belief or simply hope, a grandmother wanting to believe her granddaughter was alive rather than facing the alternative possibility. But on November 22, 1995, all theories about Nicole running away were shattered in the most horrible way possible. The family's worst fears were confirmed when a hiker made a grim discovery. Walking between the villages of Lierop and Mierlo in the Netherlands, the hiker came across the body of a teenage girl. The remains were in an area that hadn't been searched before, a location that wouldn't have been on anyone's radar based on where Nicole's bicycle and backpack were found. The body was identified as Nicole Vandenhurk. She hadn't run away. She hadn't started a new life in Germany. She had been murdered, and her body had been left in a field between two small villages, waiting to be discovered. The autopsy revealed the full horror of what had been done to this 15-year-old girl. Nicole had suffered brutal, violent injuries during her final moments. Her jaw had been fractured in 2 places. She had wounds on her head and on her fingers. The medical examiner determined that Nicole had been sexually assaulted, adding another layer of violation to her murder. The cause of death was identified as a fatal stab wound to her ribs. Someone had stabbed Nicole with enough force to penetrate her ribcage and cause fatal internal injuries. The discovery of Nicole's body transformed the investigation entirely. This was now definitively a murder case, one of the most serious crimes police investigate. All the resources that had been devoted to finding her would now be devoted to finding her killer. But identifying the perpetrator would prove to be extraordinarily difficult. On November 28, 1995, Nicole's funeral was held. Approximately 1,000 people attended the ceremony, a testament to how deeply her death had affected the community. Friends, family, classmates, teachers, neighbors, and strangers who had followed her case all came to pay their respects to a young life cut brutally short. For Ad Vandenhurk and the rest of Nicole's family, it must have been unbearable. The hope that she might still be alive, that she might be found safe, had been extinguished. Now they faced the reality of burying a 15-year-old girl and somehow finding a way to live with that loss. For the police, the investigation entered a new phase. They now had a body, which meant they had forensic evidence. The autopsy had revealed the manner of death and confirmed sexual assault. Physical evidence could potentially be recovered: DNA from the perpetrator, fibers, anything that might lead them to the killer. The location where Nicole's body was found could be examined for clues. There might be witnesses who had seen something suspicious in that area. All of these avenues would be explored. But as weeks turned into months, the investigation began to slow down. In January of 1996, just 2 months after Nicole's body was found, the scale of the investigating team was drastically reduced. The specialized task force of 15 officers that had been assembled when Nicole first went missing was scaled down to just 4 people. This is standard procedure in many investigations. The intense initial push requires significant resources. But as leads are exhausted and the case becomes more of a long-term investigation, fewer personnel are needed to continue examining new leads and following up on civilian tips. Those 4 remaining investigators continued their work, but the case was getting colder. Then, in February of 1996, something bizarre happened that thrust Nicole's case back into the media spotlight. A teenage girl from Eindhoven was arrested in Miami, Florida, for drug smuggling. This was international news in itself, a Dutch teenager caught smuggling drugs in the United States. But during her interview with law enforcement, she made a claim that seemed almost too sensational to be true. She told investigators that she knew who had murdered Nicole Vandenhurk. According to her story, she had been forced into drug smuggling by a criminal gang based in Eindhoven, and this same gang was involved in Nicole's death. It was a shocking allegation, one that would explain why Nicole's murder had been so difficult to solve. If organized criminals were involved, they would have the resources and knowledge to cover their tracks, to dispose of evidence, to intimidate potential witnesses. Nicole's father, Ad Vandenhurk, reported that he actually knew this girl, and significantly, he said he believed her story. For a father desperate for answers about his daughter's murder, this must have seemed like a breakthrough, a real lead that could finally bring justice. But the police were far more skeptical. They investigated the girl's claims thoroughly, but by late March, they publicly stated that they could find no evidence to corroborate her testimony. Her version of events didn't add up. There were inconsistencies, things that didn't make sense. Whether she was lying for attention, trying to reduce her own legal troubles, or genuinely confused about what she knew, the end result was the same. This lead went nowhere. On May 22, 1996, the investigation took yet another surprising and dramatic turn. Nicole's stepbrother, Andy Vandenhurk, was arrested on suspicion of involvement in his stepsister's murder. This must have sent shockwaves through the family and the community. Andy was Ad Vandenhurk's son, which made him Nicole's stepbrother. They had grown up together, lived in the same household, been part of the same family unit. The idea that he might have been involved in her death was almost unthinkable. Andy was taken into custody and interrogated for 5 full days. Police would have questioned him relentlessly, looking for any inconsistency in his story, any evidence that he knew more than he was saying, any indication of guilt. They would have examined his alibi for the morning of October 6, looked at his relationship with Nicole, tried to establish whether he had motive and opportunity to commit this crime. But after 5 days, Andy Vandenhurk was released. There was simply no evidence against him. Nothing in his interviews had revealed guilty knowledge. His alibi apparently checked out. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime. The police officially ruled him out as a suspect. It's unclear what led them to suspect Andy in the first place, but whatever that suspicion was based on, it didn't hold up under investigation. However, the focus on Nicole's family didn't end there. If Andy wasn't involved, perhaps someone else in the family circle was. On June 7, 1996, 8 months after Nicole's body was found, police made another arrest. This time, they took into custody Ad Vandenhurk himself, Nicole's stepfather, the man who had raised her, the man who had custody of her after his divorce from her mother, the man who had been publicly grieving her death and demanding justice for his daughter. The arrest of Ad Vandenhurk must have been devastating for those who knew the family. Here was a man who had lost his stepdaughter to a brutal murder, and now he was being accused of being responsible for that murder. The investigation into Ad would have been thorough and intense. Police don't arrest the parent of a murder victim lightly. They must have had some reason to suspect him, some piece of evidence or testimony that pointed in his direction. Ad was held for 6 days before being released. Just like his son before him, there was no evidence to support the allegations against him. He was ruled out of the investigation and sent home, but the damage to his reputation had already been done. Being arrested for the murder of your own child, even if you're later cleared, is the kind of accusation that follows a person forever. In the years following his release, Vandenhurk spoke publicly about the experience and the impact it had on his life. At first, he said, he tried to make the best of the situation despite how the allegations stuck to him like tar. He told reporters about the media frenzy that surrounded his arrest, saying, "The only thing I thought at the time was, I'm more famous than the average Dutch person. I'll use that to let everyone know that my child's bed hasn't been slept in. Maybe someone would recognize her on the street." It was a heartbreaking statement, a father trying to find some silver lining in being publicly accused of murdering his daughter, hoping that at least the attention might help solve her case. But as years passed and Nicole's murder remained unsolved, Ad's attitude toward the police investigation soured considerably. In an interview in 2005, 10 years after Nicole's death, Ad slammed the police and their investigative skills, or lack thereof. He was bitter about the way he and his family had been treated, about being accused of hiding something when they were desperate for answers. He told the Eindhoven daily newspaper in no uncertain terms, "It's 100% their fault that it hasn't been solved. They had an accountant look for clues. I went into the woods at night with a flashlight and I provided all sorts of information. The police only focused on me and my family. That's why whoever did it could just laugh and erase all traces." His frustration was understandable. While police were spending time and resources investigating him and his son, the real killer was free and potentially destroying evidence. The tunnel vision that sometimes affects investigations, where police fixate on one suspect or theory to the exclusion of others, may have cost precious time in finding Nicole's actual murderer. Interestingly, Andy Vandenhurk, Nicole's stepbrother, didn't feel quite as slighted by the police's suspicions. In later interviews, he acknowledged that he understood why police had looked at him. He recalled falling in with a bad crowd during that period of his life, drinking heavily, and refusing to cooperate with investigators back when his sister vanished. He had been 21 years old when he was arrested in 1996, young and troubled and not making good decisions. So it wasn't entirely surprising that authorities were suspicious of him. He could see, in retrospect, why his behavior and attitude might have raised red flags. Years later, Andy cleaned up his act significantly. By 2005, he had moved to England and was living and working in Stevenage. He had turned his life around, leaving behind the drinking and the bad influences that had characterized his early 20s. Meanwhile, his father had also left the Netherlands, relocating to Benidorm, Spain. Ad's life had fallen apart in the aftermath of Nicole's death and the subsequent investigation. His burgeoning music career had collapsed. His relationship with his wife Yolanda had broken down under the strain of everything that had transpired. He needed a fresh start, and he found it in Spain. For 15 long years, Nicole's case lay dormant. The investigation never officially closed. Murder cases don't have statutes of limitations in most jurisdictions, but active work on the case had essentially stopped. The 4-person team that had been working on it in the late 90s had been disbanded or reassigned. Nicole's case files sat in storage, gathering dust, just one of many unsolved murders that plagued police departments around the world. In 2004, there was a brief flicker of renewed activity. A cold case team took a look at Nicole's murder, reviewing the evidence and the investigation to see if there were any new angles worth pursuing, any leads that might have been missed in the original investigation. But they came up empty. After their review, they concluded that there were no new investigative avenues to explore. The case went back into dormancy. Then, on March 8, 2011, something extraordinary happened. Andy Vandenhurk, now living in England and having had nothing to do with Nicole's case for 15 years, made a post on Facebook that would shock everyone who read it. In the post, Andy confessed to murdering his stepsister Nicole. He stated that he planned to turn himself in to the police in Stevenage, where he was living. Imagine seeing that post if you were a friend or family member. The implications were staggering. Andy had been investigated and cleared in the original investigation. Everyone who knew him believed he was innocent. And now, 15 years later, he was saying he'd done it? Why? Why would someone confess to murder after all this time? Was it guilt finally becoming too much to bear? Was he dying and wanted to clear his conscience? Had he been living with this secret for 15 years, and it had finally become unbearable? Several weeks after the Facebook post, on March 30th, Andy was extradited from England to the Netherlands. He had indeed turned himself into English police, as he'd said he would. Now he was back in his home country, facing Dutch investigators who were very interested in hearing what he had to say about Nicole's murder. Andy was extensively questioned. The interrogation would have been intense, investigators trying to get a full confession, asking for details that only the killer would know, trying to build a prosecutable case. But there was a problem. The only evidence they had against Andy was the Facebook post itself. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. There was no circumstantial evidence. There were no witnesses. His original alibi from 1995 still held up. After 5 days of questioning, the police had to let him go. They simply had nothing concrete to charge him with. Following his release, Andy did something that explained everything. He recanted his admission. He publicly stated that he had never killed Nicole and that his confession had been a lie. But it wasn't a meaningless lie. It was a calculated, desperate attempt to accomplish something that seemed impossible through normal channels: reopening Nicole's case and pushing the investigation forward. Andy explained his reasoning to reporters. He wanted Nicole's body exhumed so that DNA could be extracted using modern forensic techniques that hadn't been available in 1995. He told outlets, "I wanted to get her exhumed and get DNA off her. I kind of set myself up and it could have gone horribly wrong. To get her exhumed, I had to put steps in place. I went to the police and said I did it. She is my sister. Absolutely. I miss her every day." Think about what Andy did. He deliberately confessed to one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, the rape and murder of his own teenage stepsister, knowing that it would destroy his reputation, knowing that people would believe he was a monster, knowing that he could potentially go to prison if his plan went wrong. And he did all of this because he believed it was the only way to force authorities to reopen Nicole's case and use modern DNA technology to find her real killer. It was an incredibly risky gambit. If the police had found any ambiguous evidence that could be interpreted as connecting him to the crime, if his interviews had contained any inconsistencies that prosecutors could exploit, if the court system had been more interested in closing the case than in finding the truth, Andy could have been convicted of a murder he didn't commit. He was betting everything on the justice system, ultimately recognizing that there was no real evidence against him, and that bet paid off, but it could easily have gone the other way. Andy's plan worked. Months later, in September of 2011, authorities made the decision to exhume Nicole's body. It had been nearly 16 years since her death, 16 years since she'd been buried. Exhumation is never undertaken lightly. It's expensive, it's traumatic for families, and there's no guarantee that a body buried for that long will yield useful evidence. But Andy's confession, even though it was ultimately revealed to be false, had provided the legal justification for exhumation that might not have existed otherwise. On September 13, 2011, investigators made a public announcement that would prove to be the breakthrough the case desperately needed. DNA had been successfully extracted from Nicole's remains, and that DNA likely belonged to her killer. The forensic technology that had been primitive in 1995 had advanced dramatically by 2011. Even from a body that had been buried for 16 years, modern DNA extraction and analysis techniques could potentially recover usable genetic material. Nicole's father, Vandenhurk, voluntarily submitted a DNA sample for comparison. This might seem odd given that he'd already been cleared as a suspect in the original investigation, but it makes sense from an investigative standpoint. The DNA from Nicole's body needed to be compared against known reference samples to eliminate contamination or degradation issues. Family members are logical reference samples for this purpose. On November 16, 2011, after the DNA had been extracted and analyzed, Nicole's remains were reinterred. The family could finally lay her to rest again, this time with the hope that her killer would soon be identified. The DNA evidence gathered from Nicole's remains revealed two distinct profiles. One of these matched her boyfriend at the time of her death, which made sense given that they were in a relationship. The presence of his DNA wasn't suspicious. Teenage couples are physically intimate, and finding his DNA on her body was entirely explainable through their consensual relationship. But the second DNA profile was from an unknown male. This was the profile that mattered. This was potentially the DNA of Nicole's killer. The cold case team working on Nicole's case in 2011 decided to employ a strategy that has solved numerous cold cases. They went back and re-examined similar crimes from the same time period and geographical area. They were looking for patterns, for other cases that might have been committed by the same perpetrator. Serial offenders often have a type of victim they target, and a method they prefer. If Nicole's killer had struck before or after her murder, there might be DNA evidence in those cases that could be compared. Their search revealed something significant. In September of 2000, 5 years after Nicole's murder, a young woman in the town of Valkenswaard had been attacked. Valkenswaard is located about 5 miles from Eindhoven, close enough that someone living in one town could easily travel to the other. The woman had been taken from her bicycle and sexually assaulted at knife point. The parallels to Nicole's case were striking. Both victims were grabbed while on bicycles, both were sexually assaulted, both attacks involved weapons or the threat of weapons. The man who had attacked the woman in Valkenswaard had been caught and convicted of the crime in 2001. He was in the system. He had a DNA profile on file. The lead detective on Nicole's case had what might be considered a stroke of investigative genius. He suggested that the unknown DNA sample from Nicole's body be compared to the DNA profile of the Valkenswaard attacker. What if the same man who had raped a woman at knife point in 2000 had also raped and murdered Nicole 5 years earlier? If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. On January 14, 2014, nearly 19 years after Nicole's murder, police made an arrest. A 46-year-old man was taken into custody after his DNA matched both the biological material and an unidentified hair that had been found on Nicole's body. The DNA match was conclusive. This was the man who had left his genetic material on a 15-year-old girl's body in 1995. Due to Dutch privacy codes that protect the identities of suspects and defendants in certain circumstances, the man was identified publicly only by a pseudonym, Jos de G. The use of pseudonyms in Dutch criminal proceedings is common and is intended to protect individuals who haven't been convicted yet, as well as to protect their families from harassment or media intrusion. What investigators discovered about Jos de G was deeply troubling. This wasn't a man who had committed one terrible crime and then lived a law-abiding life. Jos de G had 3 prior rape convictions on his record. He was a serial rapist, a man who had repeatedly targeted and sexually assaulted women. For at least one of these offenses, he had been sentenced to 3 years of preventive detention and compulsory treatment. This meant that authorities had already recognized him as a dangerous sexual offender who needed specialized intervention. The fact that Jos de G had been in the system, had been convicted of rape, had even received treatment for his offending, and yet had still been free to rape and murder Nicole Vandenhurk in 1995 raises troubling questions about the criminal justice system's ability to protect the public from known dangerous offenders. If he'd already committed rapes before Nicole's murder, why was he free? If he'd been in treatment, why had it failed? These are questions that Nicole's family and advocates for crime victims would certainly be asking. The DNA evidence was the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence against Jos de G, but his defense lawyers were quick to identify potential weaknesses in that evidence. They pointed out that Nicole's body had been lying outside, exposed to the elements, for 7 weeks before she was found. During those 7 weeks, rain, wind, temperature changes, animals, insects, and decomposition would all have been affecting the body and any evidence on it. There was a high risk of DNA degradation and contamination. Furthermore, The defense noted that DNA evidence preservation techniques in the 1990s were much more primitive than modern standards. In 1995, investigators might not have taken the same precautions in collecting, storing, and preserving DNA evidence that would be standard practice today. The evidence had then been stored for 16 years before being retested. Storage conditions during that time could have further degraded or contaminated the samples. And while DNA analysis technology had advanced significantly by 2011, it still wasn't as sophisticated as it would become in later years. These were legitimate concerns from a forensic science perspective. DNA evidence is only as good as the collection, preservation, and analysis methods used. If any step in that chain is compromised, the results can be questionable. The defense was arguing that the DNA evidence against their client might not be reliable enough to support a conviction. DNA experts were brought in to examine the evidence independently and provide expert testimony. These forensic scientists agreed that two distinct DNA profiles were visible in the samples taken from Nicole's body. This corroborated what the prosecution was saying. There was DNA from Nicole's boyfriend and DNA from another male, presumably her attacker. However, the experts also noted something that complicated the picture. Some of the peaks in the DNA analysis did not conclusively match Jas de G's profile. This led to allegations from the defense that a third person's DNA was present on Nicole's body. If there was DNA from a third person, the defense argued, it meant that someone else might have been involved in Nicole's rape and murder. Perhaps Jas de G had been intimate with Nicole at some point, leaving his DNA on her body, but someone else had actually killed her. Or perhaps the third person's DNA was from contamination during the investigation or storage. Either way, the defense maintained that the presence of unexplained DNA created reasonable doubt about their client's guilt. Forensic experts offered a different explanation for the anomalous peaks in the DNA profile. They suggested that instead of being evidence of a third person, these irregularities were the result of DNA degradation. When DNA degrades over time or due to environmental exposure, it doesn't degrade uniformly. Some parts of the genetic sequence might be well preserved while others break down. This can create unusual patterns in DNA analysis that might appear to be from multiple sources, but are actually just artifacts of degradation. The question of whether there was third-party DNA present would eventually make its way to the Dutch Supreme Court. The court examined the evidence, the expert testimony, and the investigation thoroughly. They rejected the notion that a third party's DNA was present, deeming it highly unlikely based on the totality of the police investigation and the forensic research. The Supreme Court concluded that regardless of the debate about degradation patterns and anomalous peaks, one thing was clear: Jas de G's DNA was definitely present on Nicole's body. And given his previous convictions for rape, he was a strong fit for being Nicole's murderer. Despite the Supreme Court's eventual ruling, the defense continued to argue about the possibility of a third party during the trial proceedings. They also put forward an alternative explanation for how their client's DNA might have ended up on Nicole's body without him being responsible for her murder. They claimed that Nicole may have had consensual sex with Jas de G before her death, and that someone else had subsequently raped and murdered her. This was an incredibly difficult argument for Nicole's family to hear. The suggestion that their 15-year-old daughter and sister had consensually engaged in sexual activity with a man old enough to be her father, a man with multiple rape convictions, must have been painful and offensive. But it was a defense strategy, an attempt to create an alternative narrative that would create reasonable doubt. The prosecution found this alternative explanation implausible. In response to the defense's claims, prosecutors made the decision to drop the murder charge against Jas de G and instead charge him with rape and manslaughter. This might seem like a step down in severity, but from a prosecutorial strategy standpoint, it made sense. Murder typically requires proof of premeditation or specific intent to kill. Manslaughter covers unlawful killings that might not have been premeditated. By charging manslaughter instead of murder, prosecutors were acknowledging the complexity of proving exactly what happened that morning in October 1995 while still holding Jas de G accountable for causing Nicole's death. When confronted with the DNA evidence against him, Jas de G initially insisted that he had never met Nicole Vandenhurk and had no contact with her at the time of her disappearance. This was a complete denial, a claim of mistaken identity or contaminated evidence. But when pressed further, his story changed. He then claimed that he may have had consensual sex with Nicole before she vanished. Notice the shift from, "I never met her," to, "We may have had consensual sex." It's the kind of evolving story that prosecutors love to point out to juries because it suggests guilt and desperation to avoid accountability. The trial finally began in November of 2015, 20 years after Nicole's murder. 2 decades had passed since that morning when a 15-year-old girl got on her bicycle and never came home. For her family, the wait for justice had been agonizing. But the trial itself would prove to be far from straightforward. Just a short time after it began, the trial was paused for 2 weeks. A witness had come forward with explosive testimony that could potentially change everything. This witness claimed that Jos de G had confessed to Nicole's murder. An excerpt from a Dutch newspaper article, the Eindhoven Daily Times, described the witness's account. "He looked at me with those cold eyes and said he had killed a girl." The witness went on to provide more disturbing details about what Jos de G had allegedly told them. According to this testimony, de G said he had sex with the girl, and she laughed about the size of his penis. He killed her because she ridiculed him. If true, this would provide a motive for the murder. A man with an already fragile ego, perhaps made worse by his sexual dysfunction or inadequacy, flying into a rage when mocked by a teenage girl. However, the defense was quick to attack the credibility of this witness. They argued that the witness was simply after the reward money that was available for information leading to the killer's conviction. In many high-profile cases, reward funds are established by families or organizations hoping to incentivize people with information to come forward. But this also creates an incentive for false testimony from people who see an opportunity for financial gain. Was this witness telling the truth about what Jos de G had said, or were they making it up to collect reward money? That determination would be up to the court, which would have to assess the witness's credibility, look for corroborating evidence, and decide whether the testimony was reliable enough to be considered. The court case continued to drag on through 2016. The DNA evidence was re-examined yet again by forensic experts, presumably to address the ongoing concerns about degradation and contamination. In April of 2016, the court heard crucial testimony from these experts. They provided a statistical analysis of the DNA match between Jos de G and the samples from Nicole's body. The expert testimony stated that it was 2.28 million times more likely than not that Jos de G's DNA was one of the samples found on Nicole's body. To put that in perspective, imagine you have 2 explanations for the DNA evidence. 1, that it came from Jos de G, and 2, that it came from someone else who happened to have a similar genetic profile. The statistical analysis was saying that the first explanation is over 2 million times more probable than the second. That's an extraordinarily strong match. While no DNA match can ever be 100% certain, there's always some infinitesimally small possibility of an identical twin or an extreme statistical coincidence. A match of this strength is about as close to certainty as forensic science can get. It wouldn't be until October of 2016 that the trial finally came to a close, nearly a year after it had begun. The prosecution pressed for a sentence of 14 years in prison for Jos de G. They laid out their case: the DNA evidence, the prior rape convictions, the testimony from the witness who claimed de G had confessed, the implausibility of the consensual sex defense. They noted that they did not believe Jos de G and Nicole had engaged in consensual sex. Nicole was already in a committed relationship with her boyfriend. She was a busy teenager juggling school, work, and social life. She didn't have time for additional romantic interests, and even if she had, the idea that she would choose to have sex with a middle-aged serial rapist was absurd. On November 21, 2016, 21 years after Nicole's death, Jos de G was found guilty of raping Nicole Vandenhurk. The court concluded that the DNA evidence, combined with his history of sexual violence, and the other evidence presented, proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he had sexually assaulted this 15-year-old girl. However, he was acquitted of the manslaughter charges. The court ruled that there was reasonable doubt about whether Jos de G had been the one to kill Nicole, citing the possibility that a third party could have been involved based on the disputed DNA evidence. Jos de G was sentenced to 5 years in prison for Nicole's rape. For many people following the case, this sentence was shockingly lenient. 5 years for raping a child who ended up murdered seems inadequate even if the murder charge didn't stick. But there was an explanation for the relatively short sentence. The court had deemed Jos de G legally insane. He had been spending time in a mental health hospital at the time of his arrest for Nicole's murder. This psychiatric history was taken into account during sentencing, resulting in a reduced prison term coupled with the expectation that he would receive ongoing psychiatric treatment. For Nicole's family, this initial verdict must have been bitterly disappointing. Yes, Jos de G had been convicted and would go to prison, but he'd been acquitted of killing her, and he'd received what seemed like a slap on the wrist sentence. This wasn't the justice they'd waited 21 years to see. Fortunately, the prosecution wasn't satisfied with the outcome either. Shortly after the verdict, they filed an appeal of the manslaughter acquittal. They believed the evidence supported not just a rape conviction but also a conviction for causing Nicole's death, and they were prepared to argue that case before a higher court. The appeal case began on August 28, 2018, nearly 2 years after the initial verdict. The appeals court would review all the evidence, hear arguments from both sides, and make their own determination about whether Jos de G should be held accountable for Nicole's death in addition to her rape. In October of 2018, the appeals court issued its ruling. The manslaughter acquittal was overturned. The appeals court concluded that the evidence did support a finding that Jos de G had not only raped Nicole but had also caused her death. Jos de G was resentenced to 12 years in prison for Nicole's rape and manslaughter. 12 years was a significant increase from the original 5-year sentence, and it reflected the full scope of what Jos de G had done. He had sexually assaulted a 15-year-old girl, and in the course of that assault or immediately after it, she had been killed. Whether he personally stabbed her or whether the trauma of the assault contributed to her death in some other way, the appeals court determined that he bore responsibility for her death and should be punished accordingly. The defense could have appealed this ruling to an even higher court, but ultimately, the 12-year sentence was upheld by the Dutch Supreme Court in 2020. Jos de G's legal options were exhausted. He would serve his 12 years in prison, and Nicole's family would finally have the justice they'd sought for 25 years. And so we reach the end of Nicole Vandenhurk's story, though of course for her family, the story never truly ends. The grief doesn't go away. The loss of a 15-year-old girl, full of promise and potential, cut down in the most brutal way imaginable, that loss echoes forever. But at least there was resolution. At least there was accountability. At least Jos de G didn't get to live out his life in freedom after what he'd done. This case is remarkable for several reasons. First, it demonstrates the incredible advancement in forensic science over just a few decades. DNA technology that was primitive in 1995 had become sophisticated enough by 2011 to extract usable genetic material from a body that had been buried for 16 years. That technological progress directly led to solving Nicole's murder. Second, it illustrates the power of persistence and unconventional thinking. Andy Vandenhurk's false confession was an audacious, risky move that easily could have backfired. He could have been wrongfully convicted. He could have spent years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. But he believed so strongly in the need to solve his stepsister's case that he was willing to take that risk. His sacrifice, and it was a sacrifice, even though it ultimately worked out, forced the system to reopen a case that had been dormant for 15 years. Third, this case shows both the strengths and weaknesses of criminal investigations. The police's initial focus on Nicole's family members, particularly Ad and Andy Vandenhurk, was understandable from an investigative standpoint. Statistics show that when children are harmed, family members are often responsible. Police have to investigate those closest to the victim. But that focus may have also allowed the real killer to escape scrutiny in the crucial early days of the investigation. Jos de G was in the system for other sexual offenses, but apparently, he was never seriously considered as a suspect in Nicole's murder until the DNA match years later. Fourth, The case highlights the challenges of prosecuting crimes based on decades-old evidence. The defense's arguments about DNA degradation and contamination were legitimate scientific concerns. The prosecution had to overcome those concerns and convince the court that despite the passage of time and the imperfect preservation of evidence, the DNA match was still reliable enough to base a conviction on. It took years of legal wrangling and multiple court proceedings, but ultimately, the prosecution succeeded. Finally, this case is a reminder that sexual predators often reoffend. Jos de G had multiple rape convictions before he attacked Nicole. He attacked another woman in Valkenswaard 5 years after killing Nicole. Men who commit sexual violence frequently have multiple victims over the course of their lives. This pattern underscores the importance of both punishing sexual offenders appropriately and providing effective treatment and monitoring to prevent reoffending. Nicole Vandenhurk was born on July 4, 1980. She died on or around October 6, 1995, just 15 years old. She should have had a full life ahead of her. She should have graduated from high school, maybe gone to university, pursued a career, fallen in love, perhaps had children of her own. All of that was stolen from her by Jos de G in an act of sexual violence and murder. Her stepfather Ad Vandenhurk spent years under suspicion, his reputation damaged, his life derailed by being falsely accused of murdering his own daughter. Her stepbrother Andy Vandenhurk took the extraordinary step of falsely confessing to murder in order to force the investigation forward. Her family lived for 21 years not knowing who had killed her, and then endured 5 more years of legal proceedings before her killer was finally held fully accountable. This is the reality of crime and its aftermath. It's not neat and tidy. It doesn't resolve quickly. The victims and their families endure years of pain, uncertainty, and frustration. But sometimes, if they persist, if they refuse to give up, if they're willing to take extraordinary measures, justice can prevail. Nicole's case is proof of that. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you for taking the time to learn about Nicole Vandenhurk and the 25-year journey to bring her killer to justice. Her story deserves to be told and remembered. Please leave a comment down below with your thoughts and reactions to this case. What do you think of Andy's decision to falsely confess? Do you think the final sentence was appropriate? How do you feel about the police's initial focus on Nicole's family? And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to 72-Hour True Crime to support our channel and see more cases like this one. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and remember that justice, though it may be delayed, can still be achieved. I'll see you next time.